One of the things I've written down several times when you were talking is we've referenced Steve Jobs several times, and once again, I'm not going to judge him as in his personal life. I know that he was sometimes not always the kindest person, but I think everybody externally knows his good qualities in the sense of being a sensational visionary. I love the fact when everybody was divesting from laptops, he was the one who said, screw you, a laptop doesn't have to cost $600 and I'm going to do it differently. I just love the fact that, and what I really loved about Steve Jobs is he couldn't give, excuse my language, a rat's ass what other people thought. If he was convinced that this was in line with the user, he was going to make it happen. And I think it resonated with the user. If we look by contrast at some of the representatives that you kind of alluded to already, we're looking at, I used to think, we used to watch James Bond movies and we used to thought these Bond villains were ridiculous. And like, how is it ever going to be that there's a private person who has so much money that they can basically leverage the world into whatever. We thought that was, we used to watch it and say, oh, this is fun to watch, but we never thought it was realistic. We've actually got people who've got the psychological profile of sociopaths and psychopaths running some of these companies, or they're habitual liars. If we're talking about the guy with the A at the beginning of his name, right? I think it's always been proven in court. If we're going to use these two things, let's go back to the CEO who might be listening to this. What would be the cheerleading sentence or thing that we can say? Listen, be more like Steve Jobs and less like Altman or any of the other ones. How should decision makers or people who might become decision makers, because it might be somebody who's in the wings, who's not in an executive position right now, what should their mind frame be? If we were to say, I don't know if it's in 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, how do you create a vision where you can say, we got it right? Yeah. I don't know if that's a distinct enough question to be able to answer, but it's kind of.
Sure. Well, I'll stick with the Steve reference since you asked it. I'll say one caveat thing, which is the legend of Steve is not actually the lived reality, and that sure, he was a passionate guy and he let that show a lot, but he was also one of the kindest, most thoughtful people I've ever come across. Right. Okay. So I had personal experiences of both ends of that spectrum. Okay. But those will go with me in my files. Good for you. For my children to inherit. But I guess the one thing to think about, I think, with Steve, the guiding principle is that he always made the customer the hero of the story. Go back to every single pitch that he ever made, every presentation he gave, when he stood up on stage and he introduced the product was not the hero. Apple was not the hero. He wasn't the hero. He was making the story that you, as the user, were going to be the hero of your own story. And you felt
that when you walked into an Apple store.
You felt it. You walked in and you're like, I'm going to use this to be, I'm going to make myself into being a hero by buying this. Now, it was a commercial thing. You had to buy the phone or buy the Mac and you had to do all that, but it was in service of making you the hero. So if you're a leader today and you're trying to figure out your AI strategy, start with the premise of how are you going to make your employees and your customers the heroes of the story with this AI. If you're doing anything else, then you have to stop and ask yourself whether it's worth it. Like you're actually denying people's capability of being the hero, which means at some point there's a villain. And guess what? If you're not making them the hero, you're probably the villain. And is that worth being the villain of the story? And sometimes you have to be. It's a hard job as a leader. Sometimes you have to deliver the hard.
You have to stand for something. To know what the deeper meaning of something is.
Sometimes you're the villain, and that is just what it is, because the world's hard and you got to do it. But you have to make sure it's worth it. Yeah. But I think too many people are drifting into this story, and they're not thinking about the fact that they're making themselves out the villain of the story. They're not, because they're not focused on who the hero really needs to be.
We have to watch out for time.